The sun over the San Miguel Valley was not a giver of life, but a taker of it. It bleached the very color from the sky, leaving a pale, hazy canvas stretched over a thirsty land. Dust, fine as sifted flour, settled on everything, a constant gritty reminder of the drought that held the Arizona territory in its fist. For 2 years, the rains had forgotten them. The earth cracked in a mosaic of despair, and the once proud San Miguel River had shriveled to a muddy artery, its pulse weak and sluggish. Only one lifeblood remained true, a silver thread winding down from the high Chiricahua Mountains. Agua Fria, the cold water, they called it, though its spring was warm and held sacred by the Apache. From those heights, it trickled and flowed, gathering strength until it reached the valley floor, where a carefully tended canal guided it first through the modest stretch of land belonging to the Valdez and Hart families. It was this water that allowed Eliza Hart to exist. Each morning, before the heat became a physical weight, she made the trip with 2 wooden buckets yoked across her shoulders. The wood was worn smooth from her hands and the hands of her mother before her. The journey was not long, but the land was unforgiving. Her worn leather boots puffed up clouds of ochre dust with every step. She walked past the skeletons of cholla cactus and the drooping arms of saguaro that seemed to raise their hands to the sky in supplication. This land, her mother's land, was a stubborn thing, much like herself. It refused to die. By mid-morning, the buckets filled and the small garden watered. Eliza would be inside the one-room adobe structure that served as the town's unofficial school. It was a school made of hope and adobe, with 3 rough-hewn benches and a slate board that had seen better days. Her students were a collection of the valley's forgotten children, the sons and daughters of Mexican vaqueros, a few quiet Apache children whose families lived on the fringes, and the children of Chinese laborers who had come to lay the tracks of the ever-expanding railroad. She taught them their letters and their numbers, taught them to read from the handful of worn books she owned. Today, a small boy named Mateo squinted at the board. "Why does the sky not give us water? Miss Eliza," he asked in Spanish, his voice earnest. Eliza tapped the slate with a piece of chalk. She looked at the faces before her, some dusty, some already showing the lines of worry that belonged to adults. "Because it is resting, Mateo," she said softly. "Sometimes even the sky needs to rest." A girl named Lynn, whose father worked on the railroad trestle, giggled. "It is a very long rest," she said. Eliza allowed herself a small smile. "Yes, it is, which means we must be very good stewards of the water we do have. Now, who can tell me what this word is?" She wrote the word justice on the board. The children were silent. It was not a word they heard often. Later, as the sun began its slow descent, a different kind of heat settled on the town, the kind that came from whiskey and boredom. A freight wagon laden with supplies from Tucson was making its slow way down the main street when 3 young ranch hands, full of liquor and foolish courage, blocked its path. The driver, a weary man with a weathered face, pulled on the reins of his mule team. "Let us pass." "Boys," the driver said, his voice tired, "I have got perishables." One of the youths, a lanky boy with a flushed face, swaggered forward. "What is the hurry? Old man, maybe you got something for us. A toll for passing through our town." The situation was a familiar one, a small fire of stupidity that could easily blaze into something terrible. People watched from the shade of overhangs, but no one moved to intervene. The law in San Miguel was Deputy Cole Maddox, and he was seldom around when needed, unless the interests of a man like Silas Burke were at stake. Just as the ranch hand reached for the mule's bridle, a figure stepped out from the space between the blacksmith's shop and the assayer's office. He moved with a quiet economy that made him seem to appear from the dust itself. He was Apache, tall and lean, his black hair tied back with a simple leather thong. He wore buckskin trousers and a plain cotton shirt, and there was nothing in his hands. His presence alone was enough to make the 3 young men pause. His name was Nantan, though some in his own Chiricahua band called him Ravenstone for the stillness he carried. He was not a warrior in the way of raids and war parties, but a scout, a protector of the trails. He knew the ways of the land, and he knew the ways of men. He looked not at the three youths, but at the freight driver. "Your axle is stressed," he said. His voice was low and calm, yet it carried over the nervous shuffling of feet. "You should have it looked at before you cross the dry wash." The driver blinked, surprised. "It is." Nantan then turned his gaze to the lanky youth. The boy's drunken bravado seemed to shrink under that steady, unblinking stare. "This man's cargo feeds the families of the miners your fathers work with. Let him pass." There was no threat in his voice, only a statement of fact. It was a simple, unadorned truth. The youth looked at his friends, who suddenly seemed very interested in the dust on their boots. He mumbled something and stepped back, pulling his friends with him. Nantan gave a slight nod to the driver, who flicked his reins with a grateful look, and the wagon creaked on its way. Then, as quietly as he had appeared, Nantan was gone, melting back into the shadows of the alley. Eliza had watched the entire exchange from the doorway of the mercantile. She had seen Nantan before, a silent figure on the ridges, a ghost in the periphery. She knew who he was, what the townsfolk said about him, about all Apache. But what she had just seen was not savagery. It was a quiet strength, a discipline that shamed the loud foolishness of the ranch hands. It was the careful handling of a delicate situation, resolved without a punch thrown or a weapon drawn. The next afternoon, the inciting incident arrived, not with the crack of a gunshot, but with the rustle of paper. Silas Burke stood on the steps of the land office, a man whose expensive suit looked out of place against the raw, dusty backdrop of San Miguel. He was not a creature of the desert. He was a man who saw the desert as something to be conquered, tamed, and stripped of its worth. He was the railroad, the copper mine, the future, and he spoke as if he were bestowing a great gift upon them all. He spoke of progress, of a new spur line that would connect the copper mine directly to the main track, bringing prosperity and jobs to the valley. His voice was smooth and persuasive, a river of promises in a dry land. Then he held up a piece of paper. "And to ensure the timely completion of this vital project," he announced, his voice booming with false magnanimity, "we have secured the necessary resources." He nodded to Deputy Cole Maddox, a man whose loyalty was as polished as the badge on his chest. "Deputy Maddox has authenticated this new deed, granting the railroad preliminary rights to the water flowing from the Agua Fria spring." A murmur went through the small crowd. All eyes turned to the canal that ran near the edge of town, the single artery of life for the whole valley. Eliza felt a cold dread snake its way up her spine. It felt as if the sun had vanished from the sky. She pushed her way through the onlookers until she stood at the front, her chin held high. "That cannot be," she said, her voice clear and steady, cutting through Burke's polished speech. Burke looked down at her, a flicker of annoyance in his eyes before he masked it with a patronizing smile. "Miss Hart, I understand your concern, but this is a matter of legal record." "My family has the legal record," Eliza countered, her hands clenched at her sides. "A deed, signed and sealed by the territorial governor, held in trust by my aunt, Doña Soledad Valdez. It grants our property first rights to that water. It always has." Cole Maddox stepped forward, his hand resting near the butt of his pistol. "Now, Eliza, let us not cause a fuss. This is official business. The paper is legitimate." Eliza looked from the deputy's smug face to Burke's cold eyes. She saw the truth of the situation laid bare. This was not business. It was theft, announced in broad daylight to a crowd of witnesses too afraid or too powerless to object. Her land, her mother's legacy, was being stolen with a piece of paper and a confident lie. "I will not be silent while you try to steal my home," she said, her gaze locked on Burke. "My aunt will bring the true deed. This town will see your forgery for what it is." She turned and walked away, the silence of the crowd pressing in on her back. She did not need to look to know they were all staring, some with pity, some with fear, some with the quiet satisfaction of those who are not the target today. The rumors began to spread almost immediately, slithering through the town like a sidewinder in the dust. They were whispers at first, in the saloon, over the counter at the mercantile. "Did you hear? The Apache are angry about the railroad. They say the iron tracks scare their spirits." That night, a small section of the canal's wooden sluice gate was found broken. The next morning, a storage shed at the edge of town, belonging to the railroad, was found with one wall scorched black. It was a clumsy, amateurish job, but it was enough. Cole Maddox made a show of investigating, his brow furrowed with theatrical concern. "It is Apache work," he declared loudly enough for all to hear. "They are trying to sabotage our progress, trying to scare us off. They are the reason the water level is dropping." Eliza knew it was a lie. It was too convenient, too perfectly timed. She knew, with a certainty that chilled her despite the heat, that this was the work of Silas Burke, carried out by his hired rustlers and validated by his pocket deputy. He was not just stealing her water with paper. He was poisoning the valley against the only people who might be a threat to his plans. The following day, as she was dismissing her students, she saw one of the little Apache girls, Kyla, drop her worn-out primer in the dusty street. The girl was too shy to retrieve it as a horse and rider approached. Before Eliza could step forward, the rider dismounted. It was Nantan. He bent down and picked up the small book, dusting it off with a gentle hand. He did not speak. He simply walked over to the little girl and held it out to her. Kayla looked up at him, her dark eyes wide, and took the book. He gave a brief, almost imperceptible nod and then turned, mounting his horse and riding out of town without a backward glance. Eliza stood frozen for a moment, the book of justice still heavy in her thoughts. She had seen the way he handled the book, with a respect that seemed out of place for a man the town called a savage. She looked from his retreating figure to the small primer in the girl's hands, and a seed of something fragile and uncertain took root in her heart. It was not quite trust, not yet. It was a cautious hope, a flicker of light in the growing darkness that threatened to consume the San Miguel Valley. The lines were being drawn, not just in the dust, but in the hearts of everyone who called this thirsty land home. The weight of the past few days pressed on Eliza not as a thought, but as a physical grime. It was in the dust that clung to her eyelashes, the tension that knotted the muscles in her shoulders, the metallic taste of fear that lingered in her mouth. Sleep offered little escape, filled with visions of bleached paper deeds and the cold, acquisitive eyes of Silas Burke. She needed to be clean, not just her body, but her spirit. Before the first hint of gray softened the eastern sky, she was up and moving. She carried a small bundle with a clean shift and a rough towel, and in her hand, a small piece of lye soap. She did not take the main path up the mountain, the one used by hunters and the occasional prospector. Instead, she slipped through the mesquite and catclaw, following a barely there trail her mother had shown her years ago, a path that led to the heart of Agua Fria. The air grew cooler as she climbed, the scent of dust giving way to the damp, mineral tang of the earth. Soon she could hear it, a gentle sigh of water and steam. The spring was hidden within a small canyon, a basin of rock where the earth's own warmth bubbled to the surface, creating a pool of clear, hot water that steamed in the cool morning air. It was a place of cleansing, a sanctuary. She paused at the edge of the clearing, her senses on alert. The world was still held in the deep blue quiet of pre-dawn. Nothing moved but the steam rising in lazy curls toward the emerging stars. Satisfied she was alone, Eliza undressed quickly, folding her clothes neatly on a flat, sun-warmed rock. She slipped into the water, the heat a blessed shock that drew a long sigh from her lungs. It was like sinking into a liquid embrace, washing away the grit and the fear. She submerged herself completely, her hair fanning out around her in the clear water. When she surfaced, she felt lighter, as if she had left some of her burden at the bottom of the pool. She sat on a smooth rock shelf beneath the surface, the water up to her shoulders, and closed her eyes. The steam warmed her face. It was here, in this place of stillness and life-giving water, that she allowed herself to pray. It was not a formal prayer, not one she had learned in Padre Ignacio's church. It was a whisper from the deepest part of her heart, a plea sent out into the vast, silent land. "If there is anyone listening," she murmured to the rising steam, "to the ancient rocks, to the dawning light, please, send me a man who knows how to keep his word. Send me someone who knows how to love with hands that do not wound. That is all I ask. A man who will stand for what is right, whose strength is in his promise, not his fist." She did not know that she was being heard. Nantan had come to the spring for his own reasons, following a tradition as old as the mountains themselves. The spring was sacred to the Chiricahua, a place where the water spirits dwelled. At the turn of each moon, it was his duty to check the markers, small, carefully placed stones that delineated the sacred ground and measured the water's flow. He moved with the silence of a shadow, his moccasins making no sound on the rocky ground. He had just reached the edge of the canyon overlook when he heard her voice. A low murmur carried on the steam. He stopped instantly. He had seen her tracks on the trail and had assumed it was one of the Apache women from a nearby camp. To find Eliza Hart here, alone and vulnerable, was an intrusion he had not intended. He could see the pale shape of her shoulders in the steaming water below. He turned his back immediately, his own code of respect absolute. He would wait for her to leave. It was her place of prayer as much as it was his. He began to step back into the cover of the rocks when a different sound stopped him. It was a dry, chilling rattle. His eyes scanned the rocks below, his body instantly tense. There, not 10 feet from where Eliza sat with her eyes closed, a diamondback rattlesnake, thick as a man's forearm, coiled on a sunning rock, its tail a blur of warning. It had been woken by her presence and now saw her as a threat. He did not have time to think. He did not have time to be delicate. "Stay still," he said. His voice was not loud, but it cut through the morning air with an authority that was impossible to ignore. "Do not move." Eliza's eyes flew open. Her heart leaped into her throat. She saw his dark form standing above, on the canyon rim, his back still turned to her. Then she heard the rattle again, closer this time. A cold terror, far worse than anything Silas Burke could inspire, seized her. She saw the snake, its head raised, its tongue flicking out to taste the air. She froze, every muscle in her body screaming for her to flee. Yet she was held captive by the primal fear of its venom. Nantan was already moving. In one fluid motion, he unslung the small bow he carried on his back. He did not use it for hunting large game, but for its speed and silence. He knocked a blunt-tipped arrow, drew, and released in a single, practiced movement. The arrow flew true, not to kill, but to strike the rock just beside the snake's head. The sharp crack of wood on stone startled the snake. Breaking its coiled focus, it struck at the spot where the arrow had hit, its fangs finding only rock before it could recoil. Nantan was already scrambling down the short, steep rock face, landing as lightly as a cat. He held a long, forked stick he had snatched from the ground. With a swift, precise movement, he pinned the snake's head to the ground. The creature thrashed, its powerful body coiling around the stick. But it was trapped. It was over in seconds. The immediate danger was gone. But Eliza was still paralyzed. The image of the snake's raised head burned into her mind. She was suddenly aware of the water, of her nakedness, of the man standing only a few yards away. A wave of panic and shame washed over her. He did not look at her. His focus remained on the snake, keeping it pinned. He drew a knife from his belt and with a quick, merciful movement, ended its life. He then stood, and without turning, he shrugged off the soft deerskin cloak he wore. He took 2 steps backward and tossed it behind him. It landed on the rock beside the pool, within her reach. "Cover yourself," he said, his voice still low and calm. "You are safe now." His respect for her was so profound, so absolute, that it cut through her fear. He had faced the danger, saved her, and his first thought was to protect her dignity. She reached out a trembling hand and pulled the cloak from the rock. The leather was supple and still held the warmth of his body. She wrapped it around herself in the water, the soft skin a comfort against her own chilled flesh. She felt shielded, not just from the morning air, but from the world itself. Only when he heard the splash and rustle of the cloak did he turn. He kept his eyes on her face. Her hair was wet and dark, slicked back from her forehead. Her eyes were wide, a mixture of terror and something else, something he could not yet name. He walked to the edge of the pool. He did not come closer. He stopped at a respectful distance, giving her space. "I heard your prayer," he said quietly. Eliza stared at him, her mind struggling to catch up. Her prayer. He had heard her most private, desperate plea. The shame returned, a hot flush on her cheeks. He saw the look on her face. He misunderstood none of it. "I will swear to be the man you prayed for," he continued, his voice resonating with a sincerity that was as solid as the mountains around them. "One who knows boundaries, one who keeps his word, and one who will keep this home, your home, safe." The world seemed to stop. The steam from the spring swirled around them, cocooning them in a world of their own. The sun had finally crested the mountains, and a ray of golden light cut through the canyon, illuminating his face. She saw the gravity in his dark eyes, the stillness of his features. He was not making a flirtatious promise. He was taking an oath. The words she had whispered to the universe had been answered by this man, this Apache scout the townspeople feared and maligned. He was offering her the very things she had prayed for: respect, integrity, protection. Her fear began to recede, replaced by a profound and startling clarity. She pulled the deerskin cloak tighter. She found her voice, and when she spoke, it was not the voice of a frightened victim, but of a woman making a pact. "You keep your distance," she said, her voice steady, "and I will listen." A small, almost imperceptible nod was his only reply. It was enough. An agreement had been struck. A line had been drawn, not between them, but around them. A circle of consent and mutual respect. After a few moments of shared silence, he gestured with his head toward the treacherous path she had taken. "The rocks are loose. That is no trail for the women who come here. We will make a better one." She watched as he began to work, his movements efficient and powerful. He tested large rocks before moving them, rolling them aside to clear a wider, more stable path. After a moment, Eliza waded to the edge of the pool, climbed out, and quickly dressed behind the cover of a large boulder. She left the deerskin cloak on the rock where she had put on her clothes. When she emerged, she began to help, breaking off sharp branches and clearing away smaller, unstable stones. They did not speak much. There was no need. They worked together with an unspoken rhythm, a shared purpose. The intimacy between them was not in words or touches, but in the simple, trusting act of working side by side to make something safer for others. It was in the way he would pause and wait for her to move out of the way before shifting a heavy stone, the way she knew instinctively which branches he wanted cleared next. In the golden morning light, they carved a new path, not just on the mountainside, but between their two worlds. When they were finished, the sun was higher in the sky, and a clear, safe trail now wound its way down to the pool. He walked with her to the spot where their paths diverged, one leading back to her farm, the other deeper into the mountains. He paused and looked back toward the spring. His eyes narrowed slightly. He walked back a few paces to the canyon edge, his gaze fixed on a particular spot near the water's source. Eliza followed him, curious. He pointed. "The marker," he said, his voice tight with a new tension. "One of the sacred stones. It has been moved." She looked where he was pointing. She could see a large, flat stone that seemed to be part of the natural landscape. But as she looked closer, she saw what he saw. There were fresh scrape marks in the dirt around it, and the stone was sitting at a slightly different angle than the others, which were embedded more deeply in the earth. The ground around it was disturbed, the work of a heavy boot, not a moccasin. It was the clumsy mark of someone who did not belong here, someone who did not understand the sanctity of the place. "Someone was here," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "Someone who does not respect the water." The fragile peace of the morning was shattered. The snake in the grass had been a warning, a physical manifestation of a far greater poison that was seeping into the valley. Someone had not only trespassed on sacred ground, but they had tampered with it, a deliberate act of desecration. And Eliza knew, with a certainty that made her blood run cold, that whoever had moved that stone was the same person trying to steal her water rights. The battle for the valley had just reached the heart of Agua Fria. The displaced marker stone at Agua Fria was a secret she and Nantan now shared, a silent testament to a violation that felt as personal as a hand laid upon her. The knowledge settled in Eliza's gut like a cold stone, a constant, heavy dread that followed her down the mountain and into the simmering pot of San Miguel. The town was alive with the nervous energy of its small autumn fair, a desperate attempt at normalcy in a time of drought and suspicion. Stalls selling dried chilies, leather goods, and sweet pan dulce lined the main street, but the laughter of the children and the chatter of the townsfolk felt thin, stretched taut over a current of fear. The day's false cheer was shattered when she saw them approaching her small farm. Deputy Cole Maddox led 3 men, none of whom she recognized as locals. They were hard men with the kind of eyes that looked at property not for its beauty or history, but for its value when taken. Eliza met them at the gate of her small fence, her hands dusty from the garden. She did not invite them in. "Miss Hart," Cole said, tipping his hat with a mockery of politeness, "we have a warrant to search the premises." "A warrant for what?" Eliza asked, her voice betraying none of the hammering in her chest. "Information regarding the recent sabotage of railroad property," he said, unfolding a piece of paper. It was a flimsy document, its wording vague and full of loopholes a child could see through. It mentioned suspicion of harboring fugitives and possessing contraband materials. It was an excuse, not a reason. "This is my land. Deputy, there are no fugitives here. Only a school teacher and her students. You are not setting foot on my property with that piece of nonsense." Cole's smile tightened. "It is a legal document," he said, refusing to comply with a lawful search is an offense. "It is a legal pretense for harassment, and you know it." Just then, Padre Ignacio hurried up the path, his brown cassock kicking up dust. His face was etched with worry. "Eliza, my child," he said, placing a gentle hand on her arm. "Perhaps it is best to cooperate. Let them look. You have nothing to hide. It will show the town you are a good, law-abiding citizen." The priest's advice was well-intentioned, born of a lifetime of seeking peace, but Eliza knew that showing weakness to a wolf only encourages it to bite. To allow these men onto her land would be to concede that they had a right to be there, that their baseless suspicions held merit. "With all due respect, Padre," she said, not taking her eyes off Cole, "the law seems to be on the side of the man with the most money, not the most truth. This paper is not law. It is intimidation. I will not be intimidated." She folded her arms. "You will leave my property now." For a long moment, no one moved. The air crackled with the unspoken challenge. Cole's men shifted, their hands moving closer to their sidearms. Cole stared at her, his eyes cold and assessing. He was not used to being defied, especially by a woman. Finally, with a short, humorless laugh, he folded the paper and tucked it into his coat. "Have it your way." Heart, he said, his voice dropping to a low, menacing tone. But every dog has its day. He turned and led his men away, their boots crunching on the dry earth with a sound like grinding teeth. Padre Ignacio wrung his hands. That was unwise. My child, men like that do not forget a slight. Sometimes. Padre, Eliza replied, her gaze following Cole's retreating back. Being wise is just another word for being afraid. That night, the sky was a black, moonless velvet, studded with the cold, distant glitter of stars. The air was still, holding the day's heat close to the ground. Eliza was mending a student's torn shirt by the light of a single kerosene lamp when she first smelled it. Smoke, sharp and acrid, not the familiar scent of a hearth fire. She threw open the door. The sight that met her eyes stole the breath from her lungs. Her grain shed. The small, sturdy building that held the harvest that was meant to see her through the winter was engulfed in flames. Orange and yellow tongues of fire licked at the night sky, devouring the dry timber with a hungry roar. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her for a second. Then her training, the hard lessons of a life lived on the edge of survival, took over. She grabbed the 2 water buckets from beside the door and ran for the canal. Her mind raced. The shed was lost. The grain was lost. But she had to keep the fire from spreading to the house, to the dry fields beyond. As she ran back, the bucket sloshing, spilling precious water, she saw that she was no longer alone. Figures were running from the nearby jackals of the vaqueros and the makeshift camp of the Chinese railroad workers. They carried buckets, blankets, anything that could hold water. There were no questions asked, no hesitation. They saw a neighbor in trouble, and they came. A small, desperate bucket brigade formed in the flickering firelight. The heat was a living thing, a beast that seared the skin and scorched the lungs. Sparks shot into the air like angry fireflies. Suddenly, a woman screamed. It was Maria, the wife of a vaquero named Ricardo. Her youngest son, little Pepe, had been playing near the shed earlier, building a fort of tumbleweeds. He was not with her. Before anyone could react, a figure emerged from the swirling smoke near the back of the burning structure. It was Nantan. No one had seen him arrive. He moved through the chaos with a terrifying calm, his face grim in the firelight. In his arms, he carried the small, coughing form of the boy. He handed Pepe to his weeping mother and then turned back to the fire without a word. He was not fighting the fire head-on. He was reading it, understanding its language. He pointed, his voice cutting through the roar of the flames, directing the men to douse the dry grass to the east, where the faint night breeze was pushing the embers. He showed them how to use wet blankets to smother the creeping lines of fire, to create a break that would starve the beast. He moved with the knowledge of a man who understood the destructive power of nature and was not intimidated by it. Eliza worked alongside him, her fear for her home now a burning, focused anger. She watched him, this silent Apache scout, as he brought order to the chaos, his calm presence a rock in the swirling tide of panic. The vaqueros, the Chinese laborers, they listened to him, following his directions without question. In the face of the flames, the town's petty prejudices burned away, leaving only the raw, urgent need to survive. Together, this unlikely alliance of farmers, cowboys, and laborers fought back the darkness. It took hours. Finally, as the first pale light of dawn touched the mountains, the fire was out. The grain shed was a blackened, smoking skeleton. The ground was a sodden, ashen mess. But the house was safe. The fields were safe. They had won. Exhausted, covered in soot and sweat, the small group stood together, looking at the devastation. Ricardo, Pepe's father, walked over to Nantan. He put a hand on his heart and bowed his head slightly. "Thank you," he said in Spanish. "You saved my son. My family is in your debt." Nantan simply nodded, his face unreadable. As the others began to disperse, drifting back to their own homes, Eliza saw Nantan standing by the town's notice board, which was nailed to the outside of the mercantile. He was not looking at the smoldering ruins of her shed, but at a piece of paper tacked to the board. It was the notice Cole Maddox had posted a few days earlier, offering a bounty for any information about the Apache saboteurs. She walked over, her bare feet silent on the dusty ground. She stood beside him, her shoulder almost touching his. He did not seem surprised by her presence. She watched him for a moment. His eyes scanned the printed words, moving from left to right with a steady, practiced rhythm. He was not just looking, he was reading. The realization struck her with the force of a physical blow. All this time, she had assumed, like everyone else in town, that he was unlettered, a man of the wilderness, not of the written word. "Do you read Shakespeare?" she asked, the question slipping out before she could stop it. The absurdity of it hung in the air between them, surrounded by the smell of smoke and the quiet devastation of the morning. He turned his head to look at her. A faint, fleeting ghost of a smile touched the corners of his mouth. It was a startling sight. His words, when they came, were dry and tinged with a humor as sharp as a shard of flint. "It is enough to be able to read a water bill," he said. "That is what it takes to save a person's home these days." The wit, the intelligence in his reply, sent a small shock through her. It was a glimpse behind the silent, stoic mask he showed the world. He was more than a scout, more than a protector. He was a man who thought, who observed, who understood the world of words and laws that was being used to crush them. Before she could think of a response, a wagon rattled up the road. It was her aunt, Doña Soledad Valdez, her face a mask of grim determination. She had heard the news in the next town and had ridden all night. She got down from the wagon, her movement stiff but resolute. She ignored the burned shed and walked straight to Eliza, taking her hands. "They are trying to break you," she said, her voice fierce. "We will not let them." She reached into a leather satchel and pulled out a long, oilskin pouch. From it, she carefully extracted a folded document. The paper was old, the ink faded, but the governor's seal at the bottom was still clear and bold. "This is the original deed," she said, pressing it into Eliza's hands. "The true one. The land and the water are yours, and your mother's before you. I am too old to be a target for men like Burke. You are the one fighting now. You must keep it safe. Hide it where no one will ever find it." Eliza looked down at the paper in her hands. It felt impossibly heavy. The weight of her family's history, her future, her very survival. This was the justice she had written on the slate for her students. Not an abstract concept, but a fragile, brittle piece of paper that stood between her and utter ruin. She looked up at Nantan, who had watched the exchange in silence. Their eyes met over the top of the deed. He had saved a child. He had helped save her home. He could read the lies tacked to the notice board. And she knew, with a certainty that went deeper than any law written on paper, that the oath he had sworn at the spring was as real and as binding as the mountains themselves. Later that day, a distraught Padre Ignacio came to see her. He had gone to his church to pray, to seek guidance in the face of the growing evil in their town, only to find the small rectory office in disarray. Papers were scattered. A small wooden chest had been pried open. "It is gone," he whispered, his face pale. "What is gone, Padre?" Eliza asked. "The official seal of the parish," he said, his voice trembling. "The press we use for all official documents, marriages, baptisms, and land grants. Someone has stolen it." A new, cold fear settled over Eliza, a fear that had nothing to do with fire or physical threats. Burke and Cole had failed to intimidate her with a vague warrant and had failed to break her spirit with an arsonist's fire. Now, they were changing tactics. They were no longer just trying to bend the law. They were preparing to rewrite it. The ashes of the grain shed were a constant, grim landmark on the edge of Eliza's property, a monument to the escalating war she found herself in. She had buried the true deed. Wrapped in its oilskin pouch, deep within the cool, packed earth of a root cellar, beneath a crate of winter squashes. It felt safer there, but she knew no place was truly safe as long as Silas Burke believed he could take what he wanted. The town market, once a place of simple commerce and community, now felt like a battlefield of whispers and sideways glances. The fire had earned her the sympathy and quiet support of the vaqueros and Chinese workers, who saw in her struggle a reflection of their own. But among the town's more established citizens, a new and uglier story was taking root. It was a poisonous weed, planted in the fertile soil of prejudice and fear. She saw it in the way the banker's wife pulled her skirts aside as Eliza passed. She heard it in the sudden silence that fell when she entered the mercantile. The rumor was a vile thing, slippery and hard to grasp. It painted her as a loose woman, a consort of the Apache. They whispered that she met him in the mountains, that she bathed with him at the sacred spring. They twisted the morning of the snake, the morning of his oath, into something cheap and sordid. Her honor, a woman's most fragile and essential possession in this world, was being systematically dismantled. It was in this charged atmosphere that Silas Burke chose to make his next move. He approached her near the blacksmith's forge, the clang of the hammer on anvil providing a rhythmic, percussive backdrop to his attack. He was dressed, as always, in clothes far too fine for the dust of San Miguel. He removed his hat, revealing his perfectly combed hair. "Miss Hart," he said, his voice a smooth, oily balm, "I was saddened to hear of your recent misfortune, a terrible tragedy. This is a dangerous land for a woman alone." "My friends and neighbors were a great help," Eliza replied coolly, refusing to give him the satisfaction of her fear. "I am not as alone as you might think." "Of course," Burke said with a dismissive wave of his hand. "But their help is temporary. What you need is permanence, security, a respected name to stand beside yours." Eliza simply stared at him, her expression unyielding. "I am a man who appreciates tenacity, Miss Hart. It is a valuable quality. I find I'm in a position to offer you a proposal that would solve all of your problems." He paused for dramatic effect. "Marry me." The blacksmith's hammer fell silent. A hush spread through the nearby stalls. This was not a private offer. It was a public declaration, a power play for all to see. "As my wife," he continued, "your debts would vanish. Your land would be protected under the umbrella of the railroad's interests. We could build a proper schoolhouse, a testament to your fine work. Think of it, a partnership. We could build the future of this valley together." His offer was a cage disguised as a palace. He was not proposing marriage. He was proposing absorption. He wanted to swallow her land, her water, her very identity, and do it all under the respectable veneer of matrimony. "No," Eliza said. The word was quiet, but it was as solid and unmovable as a mountain. Burke's smile did not falter, but a coldness crept into his eyes. "Do not be hasty. An offer like this is not one a woman in your position should so easily refuse. Your reputation is already in tatters." "My reputation is my own business, Mr. Burke, and my answer is no." She turned her back on him and walked away, every eye in the marketplace following her. She did not run, she did not falter, but she could feel the daggers of their stares, sharpened by Burke's public rejection. Later that day, she saw Padre Ignacio leaving the small, temporary office Silas Burke had established in the hotel. The priest looked shaken, his face pale and drawn. He saw Eliza and hurried over, his hands twisting the wooden rosary that hung from his belt. "He sent for me," the priest said, his voice low and agitated. "Mr. Burke." "What did he want, Padre?" He spoke of the church, of its needs, the leaky roof, the fund for the orphanage. He offered a very generous donation, enough to solve all our problems for years to come. Eliza waited. She knew there was more. But he said his generosity was dependent on the community showing its full support for his endeavors. For the railroad, he said that any dissenting voices could jeopardize the well-being of the parish. He looked at her, his eyes full of a terrible, weary conflict. He was asking me to speak to you, my child, to urge you to be reasonable, to accept his offer. He threatened you, Eliza stated flatly. He used the poor and the orphan to threaten a man of God. Padre Ignacio looked away, toward the dusty foothills. "It is a difficult position," he murmured. The needs of the many do not justify the robbery of the one," she said, her voice harder than she intended. "He has stolen your seal, Padre. Now he is trying to steal your conscience." The conversation left a bitter taste in her mouth. Burke's tentacles were everywhere, squeezing the very soul of the town. The pressure was building, and she felt as if she were standing alone against a rising tide. The breaking point came 2 days later. Doña Soledad had come into town to purchase supplies, her wagon parked in front of the mercantile. As the old woman stepped down from the wagon seat, 2 of the hard-faced men Eliza had seen with Cole Maddox before moved to block her path. "Ma'am," one of them said, his voice a low growl, "the deputy would like a word with you, and he would like to see that old deed you carry around." Doña Soledad clutched her satchel to her chest. "I have no business with the deputy," she said, her voice trembling but defiant. The man reached out and snatched the satchel from her grasp. The leather strap broke with a sharp crack. The bag fell to the ground, its contents spilling into the dust. The man laughed and bent down to scoop it up. It was then that Nantan moved. Eliza had not even seen him. He had been a part of the shadows by the livery stable, a silent observer. He crossed the street in 3 long, silent strides. He did not touch the man who had taken the bag. He simply stood in front of him, a silent, unmovable obstacle. His presence was so sudden, so charged with a quiet, lethal intensity, that the man froze, his hand hovering over the satchel. The second man, seeing his partner hesitate, drew his pistol. Before he could raise it, Eliza, who had been running from across the street, acted. She had her father's old Colt Peacemaker tucked into the waistband of her skirt, hidden by her shawl. She drew it now, cocking the hammer with a practiced thumb. The sound, a loud, metallic double click, was a definitive statement. She did not aim at the man. She aimed at the water trough a few feet to his left. She fired. The shot was deafening in the still afternoon air. A geyser of water and splintered wood erupted from the trough. "Leave her alone," Eliza commanded, her voice ringing with cold fury. The 2 men, startled by the gunshot and unnerved by Nantan's silent presence, exchanged a panicked look. They were thugs, not gunmen. They had been paid for intimidation, not a shootout. The first man dropped the satchel and they both backed away, then turned and fled toward the saloon where their courage was sold by the bottle. Nantan bent down, retrieved the satchel, and handed it to a shaken Doña Soledad. Eliza rushed to her aunt's side. "Are you all right, Tia?" "I am fine," the old woman said, though her face was pale, just angry. "They are cowards." Nantan's eyes were not on them. They were scanning the alleyways, the rooftops. He knew this was not over. "They will try again," he said. "They wanted the papers. They know she has them." "We need to get her out of town," Eliza said. Nantan nodded. He pointed toward the high, narrow pass at the end of the valley, a shortcut through the foothills known as Wind Gap. "Take the wagon. Go that way. I will follow." The chase was a frantic, bone-jarring affair. Eliza drove the wagon hard, the horses straining, the wheels bouncing over the rocky, uneven trail. She could see dust clouds behind them, 2 riders pushing their horses hard in pursuit. They were gaining. As they entered the narrow confines of Wind Gap, the canyon walls rising steeply on either side, Nantan appeared as if from the rock itself, now on his own paint horse. He rode alongside the wagon. "Ambush ahead," he said, his voice calm despite their desperate flight. "Around the next bend, 3 men, on the ridge to the right." "How do you know?" "The wind is wrong," he said simply. It brings the scent of their horses, and the birds are silent. He reined his horse in, letting the wagon pass him. He unslung his bow. Eliza's heart pounded. 5 men against the 2 of them. She looked down at the Colt in her lap. It held 5 more shots. As the wagon rounded the bend, she saw them. 3 men on the rocky ledge above, rifles in their hands. The 2 riders behind them were closing in fast. They were caught in a trap. "Now!" Nantan shouted. Eliza knew what she had to do. She pulled back on the reins with all her strength, screaming, "Whoa!" The horses, startled by the command, reared and plunged, bringing the heavy wagon to a chaotic, lurching halt. The sudden stop threw the riders behind them into confusion, forcing them to swerve to avoid crashing into the back of the wagon. In that moment of chaos, an arrow hissed from behind the wagon. One of the men on the ridge cried out and dropped his rifle. Clutching at his shoulder, Nantan's shot had been precise, aimed to wound, not to kill. Eliza raised her pistol and fired into the rock face just above the remaining 2 riflemen. The bullet screamed off the rock, sending chips of granite flying. It was not an accurate shot, but it did not have to be. It was enough to make them duck for cover, to spoil their aim. Nantan used the distraction to loose 2 more arrows, not at the men, but at the scree slope just below them. The blunt arrows struck the loose rock, starting a small landslide of pebbles and dust. It was not enough to bury them, but it made their footing treacherous and their position untenable. The men, both on the ridge and behind the wagon, had expected an easy capture of 2 women. They had not expected an Apache scout with a bow as fast as lightning and a schoolteacher who shot like a veteran. Their nerve broke. The men on the ridge scrambled back from the unstable edge. The riders behind them reined their horses around and galloped back the way they had come. The silence that descended on the canyon was profound, broken only by the panting of the horses and the whisper of the wind. Just as the adrenaline began to fade, the sky, which had been a merciless, pale blue all day, opened up. A sudden, violent thunderstorm, common in the autumn mountains, unleashed a torrent of cold rain. "This way," Nantan said, grabbing the bridle of the lead horse. "There is a cave." He led them off the trail, into a small, hidden alcove, a shallow cave carved into the canyon wall by centuries of wind and water. It was not deep, but it was enough to shelter them and the horses from the worst of the downpour. Inside, the world was reduced to the sound of the rain and the smell of wet earth and damp leather. Eliza helped her aunt settle onto a dry patch of ground, then turned to Nantan. He was checking his horse, his hands moving with gentle reassurance over the animal's damp hide. She saw a dark stain spreading on the sleeve of his buckskin shirt, near his wrist. "You are hurt," she said. He glanced down as if only just noticing it. "A graze," he said. "A rock chip from your bullet." "Let me see." He hesitated for a moment, then held out his arm. The cut was not deep, but it was bleeding freely, a jagged line across the back of his hand. Without a word, Eliza tore a long strip from the hem of her petticoat. She unhooked her canteen from the wagon. The water was precious, but she poured a small amount onto the cloth, her movements efficient and practical. She gently cleaned the wound. Her touch was light, yet her fingers were steady. The world outside the small cave vanished. There was only the sound of the rain and the feeling of her hands on his skin. He stood perfectly still, watching her. His stoicism, his famous stillness, seemed to have a small crack in it. She could feel a fine tremor in the muscles of his arm. When she was finished cleaning the wound, she wrapped the clean but dry end of the cloth around his hand, tying a neat, firm knot. Her fingers brushed against his. For a heartbeat, neither of them moved. A spark, quiet and potent, passed between them. It was a current of unspoken understanding, of shared danger, of a trust that had been forged in fire and chaos. She looked up and met his eyes. The intensity in his gaze was so profound it made her breath catch. He did not press, he did not ask for more. He simply held her gaze. a silent acknowledgement of the moment that passed between them. It was the promise from the spring, holding true in the heart of a storm. She finally let go of his hand and stepped back. The spell broken, the boundary was still there, respected by them both. They waited out the storm in silence, the air thick with unspoken things. As the rain finally softened to a drizzle and the sky began to brighten, they heard the sound of a running horse, a young Chinese man, one of the railroad workers Eliza recognized from her school, slid his horse to a stop at the mouth of the cave. His name was Liang, and his face was slick with rain and fear. He saw Eliza and Nantan, and relief washed over his features. He spoke in a torrent of rushed, anxious English. "Miss Hart, Ravenstone, you must know. A train comes tonight. From the east, Mr. Burke tells everyone it carries new surveying equipment. It is a lie. I saw the crates. I saw the markings. It is not equipment. It is dynamite. Enough to bring down half the mountain." The news of the dynamite fell into the small cave's quiet atmosphere like a boulder into a still pond. Liang's words, heavy with fear and urgency, hung in the damp air, painting a picture of catastrophic destruction. Silas Burke was not just trying to steal their water with fraudulent paper and hired thugs. He was preparing to rip the very earth apart to divert its flow, to bleed the valley dry for the sake of his copper and iron. There was no time for deliberation. Doña Soledad, her face grim but her eyes resolute, was helped into the back of the wagon. Eliza pressed her aunt's hand. "Go to the mission at San Xavier," she said. "Stay there until I send word. You will be safe." Nantan spoke quietly to Liang in a mixture of Spanish and English, his questions quick and precise. The location of the trestle bridge, the timing of the train, the number of men guarding the site. Liang, his fear now tempered by a sense of purpose, answered everything. He and his fellow workers had been watching, listening. They were treated as little more than beasts of burden by Burke's foreman, and their invisibility had become their greatest weapon. "We will not let this happen." Ricardo, the vaquero whose son Nantan had saved from the fire, said. He had arrived with another man, drawn by the commotion. His loyalty, and that of his men, was no longer a question. A plan, desperate and fragile, was forged in the dying light of the storm. They would not attack the train. That was a fool's game, a path to slaughter. Their target was the bridge abutment, the massive stone and timber foundation where the dynamite was to be set. They had to stop the men on the ground, expose the plot, and seize the evidence of Burke's crime. The night was a blanket of impenetrable blackness. The storm had scoured the air, and now the stars seemed close enough to touch, their cold light offering no comfort. The meeting place was the railroad workers' camp, a collection of humble tents and lean-tos on the far side of the dry creek bed. In the flickering light of a few carefully shielded lanterns, the small alliance gathered. Nantan, Eliza, Ricardo, and 4 of his most trusted vaqueros, and a dozen Chinese laborers led by Liang, their faces grim and set. Liang produced a crumpled piece of paper. "It is a page from the foreman's ledger," he whispered. "His English careful. I took it from his tent. He lists payments, names of men. Deputy Maddox's name is there. This is a record of Burke's bribes." The paper felt electric in Eliza's hand. It was more than proof of dynamite. It was the root of the corruption, the link between Burke's money and Cole's treachery. One of the vaqueros, a quiet man named Felipe who had always been quick with a friendly nod, spoke up. "Cole Maddox is a snake, but he is still the law. To go against him is a dangerous thing. Are we sure this is the only way?" Ricardo clapped him on the shoulder. "We are sure," he said firmly. "Nantan saved my boy. Miss Hart teaches our children. Their fight is our fight. This is about the water. Without it, we are all just dust." Felipe nodded, but his eyes darted nervously into the darkness. They moved out in 2 groups. Liang and his men would circle around, their knowledge of the construction site a map in the darkness. their goal to secure the rest of the foreman's ledger and create a diversion if necessary. Nantan, Eliza, and the vaqueros would approach the trestle bridge directly, using the deep shadows of the dry creek bed for cover. The air grew thick with the smell of coal smoke and iron. Ahead, the trestle bridge loomed against the starry sky, a skeletal giant of timber and steel. Lanterns cast pockets of yellow light on the ground below, illuminating a small group of men. Eliza could clearly see Deputy Cole Maddox, his badge catching the light. He was directing two of Burke's thugs as they unloaded heavy wooden crates from a handcart. The dynamite. They crept closer, the soft leather of their boots making no sound on the sand and gravel. They were almost in position when the betrayal came. It was a small sound, a scuff of a boot on rock, but in the tense silence, it was as loud as a gunshot. Cole Maddox spun around, his hand flying to his pistol. "Who is there?" Before anyone could react, Felipe, the quiet vaquero, stood up from his crouched position behind a cluster of boulders. "It is them!" he shouted, his voice cracking with fear and greed. "They are here." Ricardo stared, his face a mask of disbelief and hurt. "Felipe? Why?" "Burke pays better than a dry well." Felipe spat back, raising the rifle he carried. He aimed at Nantan. The world slowed down. Nantan moved, a blur of motion, diving for the cover of a different rock, but Felipe's shot was already on its way. The bullet screamed past Nantan's head, close enough to sting his cheek, and slammed into his side, tearing through the muscle of his ribs. It was not a fatal wound, but the impact sent him staggering, a grunt of pain escaping his lips. Chaos erupted. Cole and his men opened fire, their shots echoing wildly in the narrow ravine. Ricardo and the other vaqueros returned fire, the night exploding with muzzle flashes and the whine of ricochets. Eliza's world had narrowed to one point of focus, Nantan. Leaning against a rock, one hand pressed to his bleeding side, trying to raise his own pistol. Cole Maddox saw it too. He took a steady aim, a cold, triumphant smirk on his face. He had a clear shot. Eliza did not think. She did not weigh the consequences. There was only a single, absolute certainty in her soul. She could not let it happen. She moved, launching herself from behind her cover, placing her own body directly in the line of fire between Cole and Nantan. The deputy's gun bucked in his hand. Eliza felt a searing, white-hot pain tear through her shoulder. It was like being struck by a bolt of lightning. The force of the impact spun her around, and she fell, her legs giving way beneath her. She landed on the hard, rocky ground, the pain a blinding wave that threatened to pull her under. Through a haze of shock, she saw Nantan's face. His expression was one of horror, a raw, unguarded agony that had nothing to do with his own wound. He lunged forward, ignoring the bullets that flew past him, and dropped to his knees at her side. He gathered her into his arms, his hand going to her shoulder, his fingers coming away slick with blood. The sight of Eliza falling, of Nantan's desperate move to shield her, broke the fever of the gunfight. Ricardo, with a roar of pure rage, charged Felipe, tackling the traitor to the ground. At the same time, a series of loud bangs and shouts erupted from the other side of the bridge. Liang and his men had launched their diversion, setting off a string of firecrackers and yelling at the top of their lungs, making their small number sound like a war party. Cole Maddox and his remaining thugs, their nerve broken by the ferocity of the vaqueros and the new threat from their flank, scrambled back toward the railroad tracks and vanished into the night. The silence that returned was heavy, punctuated by Eliza's ragged breaths and the sound of Ricardo subduing the traitorous Felipe. Nantan gently eased Eliza into a sitting position, his body shielding hers. He tore a strip from his own shirt, his movements urgent but surprisingly gentle, and pressed the makeshift bandage against her shoulder to staunch the bleeding. His face was inches from hers. The stoic mask was gone, shattered. In his eyes, she saw a terrifying vulnerability, a depth of feeling that mirrored the storm raging inside her own heart. She had faced down Burke. She had faced fire. She had faced guns. But nothing had ever felt as real, as terrifying, as profound as this. She had been willing to die for him. He whispered her name, the sound a raw prayer in the darkness. She reached up with her good hand and touched his face, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. In that moment, surrounded by the smell of gunpowder and the metallic tang of blood, the world fell away. There were no deeds, no dynamite, no betrayals. There was only the man who had sworn an oath to her at the spring, and the undeniable truth that her life was now inextricably bound to his. He lowered his head, and his lips met hers. The kiss was not gentle or romantic. It was desperate, a raw and honest affirmation of life in the very face of death. It was short, fierce, and it tasted of dust and fear and a startling, unshakable tenderness. It was the sealing of a pact that had been made with a whispered prayer and forged in shared danger. It was the truth, spoken without words. When he pulled back, the world rushed in again. Ricardo was tying Felipe's hands. Liang and his men were emerging from the shadows, carrying a heavy metal lockbox. They had found the foreman's office and secured the complete ledger. They had won the battle. They had the dynamite, the ledger, and the traitor. But Eliza knew, as the pain in her shoulder began to throb with a fierce, burning rhythm, that the war was far from over. Back at her farmhouse, the smell of antiseptic filled the small kitchen. Doña Soledad, it turned out, had not gone far, her intuition telling her to wait. She was now cleaning and bandaging Eliza's wound and the gash on Nantan's side with practiced, steady hands. The bullet had passed clean through the flesh of Eliza's shoulder, a painful but not a mortal wound. They sat around the table, the captured ledger and Felipe's rifle lying in the center like trophies from a war. They had a prisoner, they had proof, and they had the original deed still buried in the cellar. "We cannot wait any longer," Eliza said, her voice weak but firm. "We take all of it, the deed, the ledger, Felipe, everything, to the county judge in Tucson. We expose Burke for what he is, in a court of law." It was a new resolve, born of blood and a shared moment of truth in the dry creek bed. They were done being victims. They were done reacting. They would now be the aggressors, armed not with dynamite, but with justice, as if summoned by their decision. A knock came at the door. It was Padre Ignacio. He looked as if he had aged 10 years in the past week. He did not look at any of them at first, his eyes fixed on the floor. In his hands, he held the heavy, ornate parish seal. "I have been a coward," he said, his voice thick with shame. "I let that man threaten my church, my flock. I let him use my fear against me, against all of you." He placed the seal on the table. "This belongs to the people, not to a man who would use it to forge lies. I will go with you to Tucson. I will testify to everything. I will tell the judge how Silas Burke tried to buy my silence and steal the good name of my office." A fragile sense of hope began to bloom in the room. They had the law, they had evidence, and now they had the moral authority of the church on their side. The hope was short-lived. A rider, a young man who worked the mail route, galloped into the yard, his horse lathered and breathing hard. He carried a fresh poster, still damp from the printing press in the territorial capital. He tacked it to the outside of the door for all to see. It was a wanted poster. It offered a substantial reward for the capture, dead or alive, of a man accused of terrorism, sabotage of railroad property, and conspiracy against the United States government. The sketch on the poster was a crude but unmistakable likeness of Nantan. Silas Burke had made his countermove. He had twisted the night's events into a new lie, painting the protector as the aggressor. Nantan was no longer just a scout. He was now a wanted fugitive. The wanted poster was not just paper and ink. It was a cage. The crude drawing of Nantan's face, the bold, damning words accusing him of terrorism. slammed a door on any hope of a swift, legal resolution. Silas Burke had played his masterstroke, transforming their pursuit of justice into a flight from a hangman's noose. To ride into Tucson now with their evidence and their prisoner would be to deliver Nantan directly to the gallows. There was no time for debate. The small farmhouse kitchen, which had briefly felt like a war room of hope, was now the epicenter of a desperate escape. Ricardo, his face a mask of grim loyalty, spoke first. "Padre, you and Doña Soledad will take Felipe and the ledger. Go north to the mission at Santa Cruz. It is small. No one will look for you there. Wait for word. Liang, you and your men must scatter. Go back to being invisible. They will not hunt for you. Not yet." He turned to Nantan and Eliza. "You two must run. Draw them away from the valley. Give us time." "You cannot go alone," Nantan said to Eliza, his voice low. "It is my name on that poster. They will hunt me, not you. Hide here. They will not harm you now that they believe I am the ringleader." Eliza looked from the wanted poster to the man standing before her, his side bandaged, his face etched with a new and terrible burden. The world had branded him a criminal. She saw the path he was offering her, a return to a life of quiet fear, a life where she might keep her land but lose her soul. She had come too far to turn back. She met his gaze, her own clear and unwavering. "You swore an oath to me at the spring," she said, her voice quiet but ringing with a strength that filled the small room. "To keep my home safe. My home is not just land and water. Nantan, it is the freedom to stand for what is right. I will not hide while they hunt the man who stands with me. I choose you." The words, simple and direct, were a vow more powerful than any legal document. They were a choice of allegiance, of family, of a shared destiny. The conflict in Nantan's eyes, the struggle between his instinct to protect her and his own desperate need for an ally, finally settled. He gave a single, slow nod. They were in this together. Their flight began under the cover of darkness, two figures on horseback melting into the vast, indifferent landscape of the Red Rock Desert. They rode hard, pushing their horses through a maze of arroyos and canyons. The jagged silhouettes of the Chiricahua Mountains their only guide. They were not running from the law. They were running from a lie. And the lie had long legs and a posse led by Cole Maddox. For 3 days, they were hunted. They saw the dust of their pursuers in the distance, a constant, menacing cloud on the horizon. They traveled at night, resting during the brutal heat of the day in the scant shade of rock outcroppings or stands of skeletal Palo Verde trees. They shared their dwindling water and dried meat in silence, the unspoken tension a third rider between them, a light, misting rain began to fall, a blessing that muffled the sound of their horses' hooves and washed the dust from the air. But it also made the rocks slick and treacherous. On the third evening, as the rain thickened into a steady, chilling drizzle, Nantan led them up a hidden trail, a path so narrow and steep it seemed impassable. They dismounted and led the horses, their lungs burning, their muscles screaming in protest. At the top, nestled in a high-protected valley, was a small cluster of wickiups, the dome-shaped dwellings of the Chiricahua Apache. Smoke, smelling of juniper and roasting meat, curled from their roofs, a welcome beacon in the desolate, rain-swept landscape. As they approached, people emerged from the dwellings, their faces curious but not hostile. An old man, his face a beautiful map of wrinkles, stepped forward. He was Nagid, the leader of this small band. Nantan spoke to him in the Apache tongue, his voice low and respectful. He explained who they were, what trouble they carried with them. He did not hide the truth. Nagid listened, his dark eyes moving from Nantan's face to Eliza's. He saw the bandages, the exhaustion, the shared determination that bound the two fugitives together. When Nantan was finished, the old man looked at Eliza. He spoke in Spanish, his voice raspy with age. "The one who stands with Ravenstone is welcome at our fire," he said. "Our water and our food are yours. Rest here. Burke's dogs will not find you in this place. The welcome was a simple, profound act of grace. That night, they sat by the communal fire, the flames pushing back the damp chill of the rain. They were given bowls of savory rabbit stew and warm, flat corn cakes. Eliza ate, the food warming her from the inside out, thawing a cold knot of fear she had not even realized she was carrying. Gid told stories of the spring, of Agua Fria. He spoke of it not as a resource, but as a living entity, the heart of the people, the place where the world was born. He explained how the markers were placed not to claim ownership, but to show respect, to measure the health of the spring, to ensure its lifeblood was shared by all creatures, man and beast alike. As he spoke, Eliza understood that for Nantan, this fight was not just about a legal right, it was a sacred duty. A small figure came and sat shyly by the fire near Eliza. It was Kayla, the young girl whose primer Nantan had retrieved. She held up a small, intricately woven basket filled with sweet wild berries, an offering of friendship. Eliza accepted with a grateful smile. Kayla, seeing the bandage on Eliza's shoulder, pointed toward the distant, unseen location of the trestle bridge. "My brother works with the Iron Road men," she said in hesitant English. "He says they built the bridge over the place where the water goes to sleep." Eliza looked at Nantan, who leaned forward. His interest piqued. "What do you mean, goes to sleep?" he asked the girl gently. She made a gesture with her hands, showing something flowing beneath the surface. "There is a channel," she said, "under the ground. When the big rains come, my grandfather would open a gate high in the hills, and the water would run through the channel to the lower valley, so our corn would not wash away. The bridge is built right over it. If the gate was open now, the water would come like a flood, a black flood in the night." The child's words, a piece of forgotten, traditional engineering, dropped into the conversation with the weight of a revelation. A black flood. A way to fight back without firing a shot. A way to use the land's own power against those who sought to desecrate it. Later, they were given a small, dry wickiup to share. It was a simple structure of bent branches and hide coverings, but it was a haven, inside. The sound of the rain was a gentle, rhythmic drumming on the taut buffalo skin roof. 2 thick fur sleeping rolls had been laid out for them, on opposite sides of the small, circular space. The warmth of the fire and the food had not eased the turmoil in Nantan's soul. He stood near the entrance, looking out at the rain-slicked rocks, his back to her. The weight of his guilt was a palpable thing in the small space. "I did this," he said, his voice low and rough. "I brought this upon you. The fire, the bullet, the chase. You should be in your home, teaching your students. Instead, you are a fugitive, hunted because of me." Eliza rose from her sleeping roll and went to stand a few feet behind him. She could see the tension in his shoulders, the rigid set of his jaw. He was a man who had sworn to be her protector, and in his own mind, he had failed. She remembered his gentle hands cleaning the wound of a stranger's horse. She remembered his calm authority in the face of fire. She remembered the terror in his eyes when he thought she was dying. "You did not pull me in, Nantan," she said softly. Her voice was firm, leaving no room for argument. "I stepped in. I saw the notice from Burke. I heard the lies Cole told. I made a choice. The same way you made a choice to help me. This is my fight as much as it is yours." He turned slowly to face her. In the dim light of the wickiup, his face was a landscape of shadows and conflict. He looked at her, at the bandage on her shoulder, at the smudge of soot still on her cheek, at the unwavering resolve in her eyes. He saw not a victim, but a partner, a warrior in her own right. "You are not like any woman I have known," he said, the words a quiet admission of awe. She allowed herself a small, weary smile. "You are not like any man I have known either." The space between them was charged with all the things they could not say, all the feelings that had grown in the crucible of their shared struggle. He took a half step toward her, his hand raising slightly as if to touch her face. Then he stopped. The oath, the boundary, it held, a testament to the promise he had made, a promise that was the very foundation of the trust between them. She went to her sleeping roll, and he to his. They lay there in the darkness, two separate beings in a shared sanctuary, listening to the rain. The steady drumming on the hide roof was a sound of cleansing, a sound of life in a thirsty land. It washed over them, a gentle absolution for the violence they had endured. In the shared silence, wrapped in the scent of rain and damp earth, an intimacy deeper than any touch grew between them. It was the quiet settling of two souls choosing to face the same storm, side by side, for the first time in days. Eliza felt a sliver of peace. The peace was shattered just before dawn. A young Apache scout, his horse breathing hard, slipped into the camp like a phantom. He had been watching the lowlands, tracking the hunters. He came directly to their wickiup and spoke in low, urgent tones to Nantan. Eliza did not need to understand the Apache words. The look on Nantan's face was a language she knew all too well. It was the look of a new and terrible disaster. He turned to her, his expression grim, his voice devoid of all emotion. "It is Cole Maddox," he said. "He has given up the chase in the mountains. He has gone back to the valley. He has taken your aunt." "He has Doña Soledad," Nantan continued, his voice flat and hard. "The scout says they are holding her at the land office. They are torturing her with thirst, giving her no water. They say they will not stop until she tells them where you have hidden the true deed." The news of Doña Soledad's capture and torture was a physical blow. For Eliza, it felt as if Cole Maddox had reached across the miles and squeezed the air from her lungs. The rage that followed was a clean, cold fire, burning away the last vestiges of fear and exhaustion. The time for running was over. The time for hiding was past. They had been reacting, always one step behind Burke's malevolence. Now, they would set the terms of the battle. A silent, furious energy propelled them back down the mountain. Nantan sent the young Apache scout, the one who had brought the terrible news, ahead of them. He was a phantom on the wind, carrying messages to their scattered allies. A meeting was set. Not a council of war, but a gathering of desperate people with nothing left to lose. They convened in the pre-dawn gloom in a hidden ravine a few miles from San Miguel. The vaqueros, Liang, Padre Ignacio, and the two fugitives. The air was thick with a shared, unspoken grief for the old woman suffering in the land office, a symbol of their collective violation. In the faint, gray light, a plan of 3 arrows was launched. Liang spoke first, his voice low and steady, his earlier fear replaced by a hard resolve. "Burke's main office is at the copper mine. His real ledgers, the ones with the territorial bribes and the payments to Cole Maddox, are kept there in an iron lockbox. The foreman's book was just a local record. My men know the guards' routines. We know when they are drunkest. We can get in tonight. We will switch the real ledger with a false one we have prepared." Ricardo, his face carved from stone in the dim light, laid out the second arrow. "My men and I will free Doña Soledad. We will create a diversion at the saloon, a brawl big enough to draw every man with a badge or a gun. In the chaos, 2 of my best men will go in through the back of the land office. They will get her out. They are ghosts. These 2, no one will see them." The third arrow was theirs. Nantan looked at Eliza, a silent question in his eyes. She answered with a firm nod. "We know the location of the hidden channel Kayla spoke of." She said to the group, "The gate that controls it is high in the hills above the trestle. We will ride there and mark the release mechanism. It is our final defense. If all else fails, we will unleash the Black Flood." Padre Ignacio, his face looking ancient and weary, outlined his own part, a mission of faith and deception. "I have sent a message to the circuit judge in Tucson. I told him there is a great unrest in San Miguel, that I fear for public safety. I have implored him to convene his hearing here, tomorrow, to settle the water rights dispute before blood is spilled. I believe he will come. A man of the law abhors the threat of chaos. This will force Burke to be here, in our valley, when his crimes are laid bare. It was a plan built on whispers and shadows, a conspiracy of the powerless against the powerful. Their only weapons were their knowledge of the land, their courage, and their trust in one another. They were farmers, laborers, a priest, and two outlaws, united against an empire of greed. They scattered as the sun rose, melting back into the landscape, each carrying their piece of the coming storm. Nantan and Eliza rode toward the high country, the silhouette of the trestle a distant, skeletal warning against the sky. They moved carefully, using the terrain for cover, knowing that Cole Maddox and his hunters would be scouring the foothills. The deputy was better than they had anticipated. He was not just a bully with a badge, he was a tracker. As they navigated a steep, rocky slope, a place with little cover, the sharp crack of a rifle echoed from the ridge above them. Nantan reacted instantly, shoving Eliza from her horse and behind a large boulder an instant before a second bullet tore through the air where she had been. He threw himself from his own mount, rolling behind cover, but he was not fast enough. The third shot caught him as he moved. The bullet struck him high on the chest, near the collarbone, spinning him around with its brutal force. He collapsed onto the loose shale, a terrible final stillness about him. Eliza's world dissolved into a single, piercing scream of his name. She saw Cole Maddox on the ridge, reloading his rifle for another shot. There was no thought, only a primal, protective rage. She raised her own pistol and fired, not aiming, but firing again and again. The shots, a frantic, desperate barrage that forced Cole to duck back behind the rocks. She scrambled to Nantan's side. He was alive, his eyes open, but they were glazed with shock and pain. Blood, dark and shockingly plentiful, soaked the front of his buckskin shirt. "We have to move," she whispered, her voice a ragged, desperate plea. She hooked her arms under his, trying to drag him. He was a dead weight, his body refusing to obey him. "Go!" he rasped, the word choked with blood. "Save yourself." Eliza looked up at the ridge. Cole would be back in a moment. She looked down at the man she loved, bleeding out on a desolate mountainside. The choice he had offered her before, to run while he fought, was no longer a choice. It was an impossibility. She took the silk shawl from her own shoulders. It was her last fine thing, a gift from her mother, embroidered with small, faded blue flowers. She pressed the soft, clean fabric against his wound, a fragile dam against a torrent of life. The crimson stain spread through the blue flowers instantly. "You seem to have a talent for getting in the way of things," she said, her voice trembling, trying to weave a shield of wit against the terror that was threatening to swallow her whole. First rock chips, now bullets. "You are a terribly inconvenient man, Ravenstone." A faint light flickered in his eyes. He recognized her desperate attempt to be brave for him. His hand came up and weakly gripped hers, his fingers pressing into her own. Through the pain, a message passed between them. He was not giving up. With a strength she did not know she possessed, she managed to get him to his feet, leaning heavily on her, stumbling and sliding on the loose rock. They made their way down the far side of the slope, out of Cole's line of sight. They found a shallow wash, a scar in the earth, and collapsed into its meager cover. He was fading, his breathing was shallow, and his skin had taken on a pale, ashen hue beneath his tan. She knew he needed more than her mother's shawl. He needed a doctor, a real bed. Time. They had none of those things. All they had was a stolen moment in a ditch, with a hunter on their trail. She held her canteen to his lips, and he drank a little. The water seemed to revive him slightly. He looked at her, his gaze clearing for a moment. "If there is another dawn," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the sound of his own ragged breathing, "we will go back to Agua Fria." Eliza leaned closer, her tears finally falling, hot and silent, onto his cheek. She finished the promise for him, her own whisper a prayer against his skin. This time, two people praying together, It was a promise for a future they both knew they might never see. A shared dream of peace in a world that had offered them only violence. It was everything. The sound of an approaching horse sent a fresh wave of fear through Eliza. She reached for her pistol, ready to make a final, hopeless stand. But the rider was not Cole Maddox. It was Ricardo. He had seen the rifle flashes from a distance and had come to investigate. His face was a storm of fury and concern when he saw Nantan. He dismounted quickly. "We must get him to the mission," he said. "Padre Ignacio will know what to do." "But the plan?" Eliza protested, her mind reeling. "Your aunt, Liang." Ricardo's expression was grim. "The plan is in motion. We must trust our friends. Right now. We must save him." They managed to get Nantan onto Ricardo's horse. The vaquero led the animal slowly, carefully, while Eliza walked beside them, her hand never leaving Nantan's, as if her touch alone could keep him tethered to the world of the living. As they reached the shelter of the foothills, another rider appeared. It was Liang, his face pale, his eyes wide with a new and urgent terror. He had ridden from the direction of the rail yard. He did not waste time on greetings. He spoke in a rush, his words tumbling over one another. A new telegraph message came through. "The judge, he is delayed. His train was held up by a rock slide on the tracks to the east. He will not arrive tomorrow." Eliza felt the ground shift beneath her feet. Their timeline, the very foundation of their plan, had just crumbled into dust. "It is worse," Liang said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Burke knows the judge is delayed. He is not waiting for a hearing. He is moving the dynamite train tonight. It will cross the trestle bridge before dawn. By the time the sun rises, the spring will be gone forever." The night was a gaping wound, and the sky bled a cold, persistent rain. Time was no longer a river. It was a waterfall, and they were plunging toward the rocks below. There was no thought of taking Nantan to the mission. No hope of a safe haven. The battle was here, and the hour was now. The news that Burke was moving the dynamite train tonight had burned away all other options, leaving only the scorched earth of a final, desperate stand. Inside the small, lamp-lit kitchen of Eliza's farmhouse, a new plan was born of necessity and despair. Ricardo and Liang looked at Nantan, who was propped up in a chair, his face pale and slick with sweat, his breathing a shallow, painful rasp. He could not ride, let alone fight. "He must," Nantan said, his voice a raw whisper that held the iron of a command. "Cole will be hunting for me. He will not be expecting me to show myself. That is our advantage." "It is suicide," Ricardo argued, his voice thick with anguish. "It is the only way," Nantan countered. "I will lead them to the trestle. I will draw them onto the bridge. It is the only place they will be trapped, with no high ground to run to." Eliza knelt before him, her mother's blood-stained shawl a testament to how close they had already come to losing everything. She placed her hand on his knee, a silent plea. He covered her hand with his own, his grip surprisingly firm. "You have your own part to play," he said, his eyes locking with hers. "The Black Flood. You are the only one who knows the story. The only one who can find the gate. You must go." Their roles were set. It was a plan with no margin for error. A two-pronged assault fueled by nothing more than courage and a shared, unspoken promise. Ricardo and his vaqueros would split. Two would ride with Nantan, providing what support they could, while Ricardo himself would lead the others to free Doña Soledad, a mission of mercy that now had to be executed in the shadow of the coming cataclysm. Liang and his men, their own mission to the mine office now more critical than ever, vanished into the night. Ghosts on a mission to steal the soul of their enemy. Eliza's ride into the high country was a frantic, desperate climb into a world of wind and driving rain. The storm, which had been a gentle misting in the desert, was a living beast in the mountains, tearing at her clothes, its icy breath trying to steal the warmth from her body. She was guided by a child's story and a landmark Nantan had described to her once, a rock formation shaped like a hawk in flight. She found the gate in a narrow, overgrown ravine, almost completely consumed by time and neglect. It was not a gate in a fence, but a massive, iron-bound slab of timber set into a stone culvert. A primitive but ingenious piece of forgotten engineering. The release mechanism was a huge iron lever, rusted into its housing by decades of disuse. She threw her entire weight against it. It did not budge. Panic, cold and sharp, clawed at her throat. Below, in the darkness, she could hear the faint, mournful cry of a train whistle. Time was running out. She grabbed a heavy rock and began to hammer at the rusted joint where the lever met the locking pin. Her grunts and cries lost in the howl of the wind. Miles away, Nantan was a ghost in the darkness, a wounded phantom leading a pack of wolves on a chase. He and the two vaqueros used every trick of the terrain, appearing and disappearing, firing single shots that echoed through the canyons, creating the illusion of a much larger force. Cole Maddox, his ego stung by his earlier failure, his blood up for the kill, took the bait. He pushed his men hard, his obsession with capturing the Apache fugitive overriding all caution. He would not be made a fool of again. He followed the trail of the phantom, a trail that led inexorably toward the skeletal silhouette of the trestle bridge. The train chugged through the night, its single headlight cutting a weak, yellow swathe through the rain. It was a short train, just an engine pushing a single flat car laden with the heavy, ominous crates of dynamite. Silas Burke stood on the flat car, his expensive coat collar turned up against the storm, a man surveying the final moments of his conquest. He felt the rumble of the engine beneath his feet, the power of the machine, the power of the dynamite, and it was the feeling of a god shaping a world to his will. Nantan reached the bridge first. He was weaving on his feet, his vision blurring. The wound in his chest was a furnace of agony. He and his two companions took cover in the rocks at the near end of the trestle. A moment later, Cole and his posse burst from the trees, their horses churning the muddy ground. They saw the figures at the end of the bridge and charged, their triumphant yells ripping through the night. High above, in the ravine, Eliza gave one final, desperate heave. With a great, groaning screech of tortured metal, the rusted pin snapped, the lever moved. She threw her entire body against it, and the heavy wooden sluice gate lifted, releasing the water that had been held back for a generation. It was not a trickle, it was a roar, a deep, guttural bellow from the belly of the earth as a torrent of black water, thick with mud and leaves and the debris of years, surged into the hidden channel. On the bridge, Cole's men reined in their horses, trapping Nantan and the vaqueros. The trap was sprung. Cole dismounted, his rifle leveled, a predator's smile on his face. "It is over, Apache." The first tremor hit then, a low, deep shudder that ran through the very rock beneath their feet. The horses shied, their eyes rolling in terror. A sound, a low rumble that grew into a deafening roar, filled the ravine. From the darkness upstream, the black flood appeared, a solid wall of churning water that filled the canyon from bank to bank. The train, halfway across the bridge, screeched to a halt, its iron wheels screaming on the wet tracks. Burke stared in disbelief as the river, which had been a dry, rocky bed moments before, was transformed into a raging, murderous torrent. The floodwaters slammed into the thick timber pilings of the trestle, shaking the entire structure. Eliza, her task done, had scrambled down a different path, a path that brought her to the edge of the ravine near the stalled train. She saw Burke standing there, his face a mask of fury and shock. "You chose the wrong side, Miss Hart!" he bellowed over the roar of the water. "I chose my home," she yelled back, her voice raw and powerful. "I did not choose a thief who steals water from the thirsty." On the bridge, the world had become a nightmare of roaring water and shaking timbers. Nantan and Cole were locked in a desperate struggle. Nantan, weakened by his wound, was no match for the deputy's raw strength. Cole slammed him against the railing, his hands closing around Nantan's throat, but Nantan was fighting on his own ground. He used his knowledge of balance, his body moving with the swaying of the bridge. Not against it. He twisted, breaking Cole's grip, and sent the deputy staggering back on the slick, wet timbers. Cole slipped. His feet went out from under him, and he fell. A cry of terror ripped from his throat. He managed to grab hold of a thick crossbeam, his body dangling over the churning, black water below. His gun was gone, swept away by the flood. He was helpless, his life hanging by his fingertips. Nantan stood over him. His chest was on fire. His vision swam. He looked down at the man who had hunted him, who had shot him, who had helped orchestrate the ruin of his life. He could simply walk away. He could let the river deliver its own justice. Instead, he knelt. He reached down and grabbed the front of Cole's shirt. With a great agonizing effort that tore a cry of pain from his own lips, he began to pull the deputy up. At that same moment, a different drama was unfolding at the San Miguel train station. The circuit judge's train, having finally cleared the rock slide, had pulled into the station, its arrival hours ahead of the new, revised schedule. Padre Ignacio, alerted by a fast rider, had gathered a small crowd of bewildered townspeople, telling them only that the fate of the valley was about to be decided. As the judge, a stern, silver-haired man, stepped onto the platform, a commotion erupted. From the roof of the station, Liang and two of his men appeared. They carried a heavy iron lockbox. With a heave, they pried it open. "Evidence!" Liang shouted, his voice ringing through the night. He began to throw handfuls of paper down onto the platform. Ledgers, receipts, letters, all bearing Silas Burke's signature, all detailing the vast network of his corruption. The papers fluttered down like a black snow, a rain of truth that fell at the feet of the law. On the bridge, Burke saw it all. He saw the flood. He saw his dynamite, his precious engine trapped and useless. He saw his crimes falling from the sky at the far end of the valley. He was ruined, and he knew who to blame. With a snarl of pure hatred, he pulled a small derringer from his waistcoat pocket and aimed it at Eliza. He never fired. Ricardo and his men, having freed Doña Soledad and ridden hard for the bridge, swarmed onto the flat car from the rear. A powerful hand clamped down on Burke's wrist, and the small gun clattered onto the wet planks. Padre Ignacio was right behind them, his face no longer that of a frightened priest, but of a wrathful angel. The trestle gave a final, shuddering groan. The section of track holding the dynamite car, its foundations eaten away by the flood, finally gave way. With a scream of twisting metal and snapping wood, the flat car and its deadly cargo plunged into the black water and were swept away into the darkness. On the bridge, Nantan finally hauled a sputtering, terrified Cole Maddox back onto the relative safety of the timbers. He looked at the man he had just saved, the man whose life he held in his hands. He had not chosen vengeance. He had chosen his own humanity. The flood waters began to recede as quickly as they had come. Their purpose served. The immediate danger was over. Silas Burke was a prisoner. Cole Maddox was a broken, disgraced man. The dynamite was gone. In the sudden ringing silence, broken only by the drip of water and the distant shouts from the town, the survivors on the trestle bridge stood as stunned witnesses to the terrible, cleansing power of the Black Flood. The dawn that followed the night of the Black Flood was not a fiery, triumphant sunrise. It was a quiet, hesitant light, filtering through a sky washed clean by the storm. The air smelled of wet earth, of ozone, and of a fragile, uncertain peace. The valley was wounded but alive. The trestle bridge stood broken, a monument to a battle won at great cost. The law, when it finally asserted itself, did so not in a grand courthouse, but on the muddy platform of the San Miguel train station. Judge Alistair Blackwood, the circuit judge, was a man whose face seemed carved from the same granite as the mountains. He had seen the evidence that had rained from the sky. He had heard the frantic, pieced-together testimonies of a dozen different people. He had looked upon the exhausted, soot-stained faces of the vaqueros, the Chinese laborers, the townspeople, and he had seen the truth. He convened his court right there, with the broken bridge as a backdrop and the town as his jury. Silas Burke, his fine suit now stained with mud and shame, stood guarded by two of Ricardo's men. He was silent, his arrogance shattered, leaving only the empty shell of a ruined man. The proceedings were swift and unorthodox. The judge declared Burke's forged water deed, the one authenticated by Cole Maddox, null and void. He reviewed the original deed, brought forth from Eliza's root cellar, its faded ink and governor's seal a testament to a more honorable time. He affirmed, in a voice that rang with the finality of iron striking iron, that the water rights to Agua Fria belonged to the Valdez and Hart property, now and forever. Then he turned to the matter of Nantan. The wanted poster was brought forth, a flimsy, ridiculous lie in the face of the night's events. Padre Ignacio spoke, his voice trembling but clear, confessing his fear and his silence, and testifying to Nantan's character. Ricardo spoke of his son, saved from a fire. Liang spoke of the quiet respect Nantan had always shown his people. Then came the most unexpected testimony of all. Cole Maddox, his arm in a sling, his face bruised and swollen, stepped forward. He did not look at the judge. He looked at Nantan. "Everything on that poster is a lie," Cole said, his voice a hoarse rasp. "I wrote it myself, on Mr. Burke's orders. He paid me. He paid me to look the other way, to forge documents, to burn a woman's home, to hunt an innocent man." He paused, his gaze dropping to the muddy planks of the platform. "Last night, on that bridge, I was going to kill him. I slipped. I should have died in that river. He saved me. The man I was paid to kill saved my life." He finally looked up at the judge, his eyes stripped bare of their swagger, of everything but a raw, desperate plea for a different kind of life. "I do not ask for mercy, Your Honor. I ask for a chance to make amends, to pay for what I have done, not with money, but with work. I will serve my time, but I want to do it here, in this valley, helping to rebuild what I helped tear down." Judge Blackwood listened to it all, his expression unchanging. When everyone had spoken, a deep silence fell over the small crowd. The judge looked at Nantan, who stood beside Eliza, his arm in a clean sling, his face pale but his posture erect. "By the letter of the law," the judge said, "you are a fugitive who resisted arrest and participated in the destruction of railroad property." He let the words hang in the air, a final test of the valley's newfound conscience. "But the law was not written for nights like last night," he continued, his voice softening almost imperceptibly. "It is the finding of this court that your actions were taken in self-defense, and in the defense of this community against a clear and present danger. Your sentence is suspended. You are a free man." A collective sigh of relief, a sound of 100 held breaths being released at once, whispered through the crowd. Eliza felt a wave of dizziness so profound she had to lean on Nantan for support. He put his good arm around her, holding her steady. It was over. The aftermath was a slow, painful, but steady process of healing. Silas Burke was taken away in irons, his name already becoming a cautionary tale whispered to children. Cole Maddox, true to his word, was sentenced to a year of hard labor, which he began immediately, working alongside the Chinese crew to clear the debris and begin the long process of rebuilding the trestle, this time with an open channel for the floodwaters, a permanent acknowledgement of the land's own power. Doña Soledad, frail but unbreakable, was resting comfortably in Eliza's home, holding court from her rocking chair, dispensing advice and sharp opinions in equal measure. The town itself seemed to take a deep, cleansing breath. The poisonous whispers and prejudices had been washed away by the black flood, leaving behind a raw but fertile ground for something new to grow. The vaqueros and the railroad workers, once separated by language and custom, now shared a bond forged in fire and water. They greeted each other in the street with the nods of respect, a new community rising from the ashes of the old. 2 days after the makeshift trial, when the sun had finally returned to warm the valley, Eliza and Nantan rode out of town. Their wounds were still fresh, their bodies aching with a deep, bone weariness. But they moved with the quiet purpose of pilgrims returning to a sacred place. They took the new path they had cleared together, the one that was safe for all women, and made their way up to the steaming, hidden pool of agua fria. The morning was perfect. The air was clean and cool, and the sky was a flawless, impossible blue. The spring steamed in the morning light, its water as clear and pure as the day of creation. They stood at the edge for a long time, not speaking, simply letting the peace of the place seep into their bruised and weary souls. Then Eliza turned to him. She did not ask. She did not seek permission. It was a statement of a new reality, a new trust that had been bought with blood and sacrifice. "I am going to bathe," she said softly. "Please, sit here and turn your back." It was a perfect reversal of their first real encounter in this very spot. Then, he had turned his back out of respect for a stranger's modesty. Now, she was inviting him into her sanctuary, asking him to turn his back as an act of absolute, shared intimacy. It was the ultimate gesture of consent, a quiet acknowledgement that the boundaries between them were no longer lines of separation, but the sacred architecture of a shared home. He understood everything she was not saying. He went to the flat rock where he had stood that first morning, and he sat, his back to the pool, a silent, steadfast guardian of her peace. Eliza slipped into the water, the heat a familiar. "Welcome embrace." She washed away the last of the soot, the last of the fear, the last of the blood. She felt as if she were being born again, not into a world of struggle and strife, but into a world of quiet promise. The water that had been the source of so much conflict was now the instrument of her healing. When she was done, she climbed out and dressed in the clean clothes she had brought. She took a moment, standing behind the cover of the rocks, to gather herself. Then she walked to where he sat. "You can turn around now," she said. He stood and turned to face her. She was wearing a simple cotton dress, her damp hair hanging loose over her shoulders. The morning sun illuminated her, and he thought she was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. The weariness was still in her eyes, but it was overlaid with a deep, quiet strength that had not been there before. "That day," she said, her voice a little more than a whisper, "the day of the snake. I prayed for a man who knew how to keep his word." He took a step closer. He reached out and took her hand, his fingers gently closing around hers. He looked down at their joined hands, then back up at her face, his dark eyes holding a universe of emotion. "I swore I would be that man," he said, his voice low and steady, a vow renewed. "And I still keep my word." In the stillness of the canyon, with the steam of the sacred spring swirling around them and the sound of the life-giving water as their only witness, he leaned in and kissed her. It was not the desperate, frantic kiss of the creek bed. It was a kiss of homecoming, of peace, of a love that had been tested in the fiercest of fires and had not only survived, but had been tempered into something unbreakable. Later that afternoon, they stood before Padre Ignacio in the cool, quiet adobe of his church. The priest's hands were steady now, his eyes clear. He had publicly confessed his weakness and, in doing so, had found a new and more profound strength. Doña Soledad stood as a witness, her sharp eyes soft with tears. Ricardo was there, and Liang, their presence a testament to the new family that had been forged in the valley. Nantan held a small leather pouch. He opened it and poured a fine, golden powder, corn pollen, into his palm, following the ancient Chiricahua tradition. He gently sprinkled the pollen over Eliza's head and shoulders, a silent blessing, a symbol of life, of fertility, of a new beginning. She closed her eyes, feeling the pollen settle on her like a benediction. Then they turned to the priest, and in the simple, quiet words of the Christian rite, they pledged their lives to one another. There were no grand promises, no flowery language, only the simple, honest vows of two people who had seen the worst of the world and had chosen to build a small piece of heaven together. They were two streams, born of different mountains, that had flowed through a valley of fire and had now, finally, joined to become one river. The drought did not break with a single, dramatic clap of thunder. It ended with a series of long, gentle rains that soaked deep into the thirsty earth, the San Miguel Valley. Once a monochrome canvas of dust and despair, slowly began to blush with the tender green of new life. The river, for so long a sluggish, muddy vein, now ran with a clear, steady pulse. But the truest sign of the valley's rebirth was the canal. Water, cool and abundant, flowed from the heart of Agua Fria, no longer a source of conflict, but a shared and sacred trust. The new era began not with a decree from a judge, but with a gathering of neighbors. Eliza called a meeting by the banks of the newly flowing channel. Everyone was there. Ricardo and his vaqueros, their weathered faces relaxed for the first time in years. Liang and the Chinese laborers, no longer standing in the shadows, but as respected members of the community. Even some of the town's merchants and ranchers, humbled by the events of the past months, came to listen. There, with the murmur of the water as their witness. Eliza did not dictate terms. She asked questions. She listened. Together, they devised a new set of rules for the water, a covenant written not on paper, but in the shared understanding of their mutual survival. Portions were allocated not by wealth or power, but by need. A council, made up of a vaquero, a laborer, and a townsperson, was formed to settle any disputes. The water of Agua Fria became what it had always been meant to be, a blessing for all, not a prize for the few. Nantan, the man they had once called a fugitive, found a new purpose. He was no longer a lone guardian of the high trails, but a teacher. He gathered the youth of the valley, a motley collection of Apache, Mexican, Chinese, and Anglo children, and he began to teach them the language of the land. He taught them how to read the story written in a broken twig or a displaced stone. He showed them which plants could heal a fever and which could staunch the flow of blood. He taught them first aid, how to set a broken bone, and most importantly, how to protect the water, not with guns, but with wisdom and respect. He was building a new generation of guardians, their loyalty not to a flag or a race, but to the valley itself. The alliance of laborers, forged in the heat of a burning shed, found a permanent form. Ricardo and Liang, with the help of a contrite Cole Maddox, who worked with the quiet diligence of a man paying a debt only he could truly measure, organized the valley's first volunteer fire brigade. They built a small firehouse near the center of town, its bell polished and proud. They practiced with buckets and wet blankets, their shared laughter echoing where once there had been only suspicion. They were no longer just vaqueros or railroad men. They were firefighters, neighbors, a shield against the random cruelties of a harsh land. In his small adobe church, Padre Ignacio's sermons changed. He no longer spoke of a distant, judgmental God. He spoke of the God he had seen in the courage of his flock. He preached about justice, not as a verdict handed down from on high, but as the daily, difficult work of seeing the humanity in one another. He spoke of the poison of gossip, of how a careless word could be as destructive as an arsonist's torch. He spoke of atonement, of the grace that could be found in admitting one's failings and working to mend the fabric of the community. The people listened, and slowly. The shame of their past silence was replaced by the quiet resolve to be better. The ugly rumors that had once clung to Eliza like a shroud withered and died in the light of this new, hard-won truth. Their wedding was not a grand affair. It was a simple gathering, a shared meal of roasted corn, savory beans, and venison, held in the open air beside the flowing canal. The whole valley came, a patchwork family of every color and creed. There were no formal speeches, only the quiet murmur of conversation, the laughter of children, and the soft strumming of a vaquero's guitar. It was a celebration not of a single couple, but of the survival of a community, of a home that had been defended and remade. That night, they sat outside their small house, a blanket wrapped around their shoulders against the cool desert air. The sky was a vast, deep indigo, strewn with a profligate spray of stars. The world was quiet, held in a perfect, peaceful stillness. "They will need a proper schoolhouse soon," Eliza said, her head resting on his shoulder. "The adobe is getting too small. We could build one, right here, by the water, with big windows to let in the light." Nantan was silent for a long time, his gaze on the infinite star field above. When he spoke, his voice was a low, gentle rumble. "A schoolhouse will need students," he said, "many students, perhaps some with your brave heart and your stubborn chin." Eliza smiled into the darkness, a warmth spreading through her chest that had nothing to do with the blanket. "And perhaps some with your quiet eyes," she whispered, "and your knack for knowing which way the wind is blowing." They sat in a comfortable silence, the unspoken dream of a family, of children, hanging in the air between them like a new and beautiful constellation. It was a future that was not yet written, a path that would unfold day by day. But they knew, with a certainty that was as deep and as true as the earth beneath them, that they would walk it together. In the days that followed, a new rhythm established itself in the valley. It was the rhythm of work, of growth, of peace. One afternoon, as the sun began its slow descent, casting long, golden shadows across the land, Eliza and Nantan walked along the bank of the canal. The water ran clear and swift beside them, its surface mirroring the vast, open sky. He reached for her hand, his fingers lacing through hers, a simple, everyday gesture that felt like a quiet miracle. High above, a lone golden eagle circled on the thermal currents, its wings outstretched, a symbol of the wild, untamable freedom that was the truest spirit of this land. Nantan paused and looked up, toward the high, rugged peaks of the Chiricahua Mountains, toward the hidden canyon that had been the heart of their struggle, the crucible of their love. From this distance, they could just make out a faint, shimmering haze rising from the rocks, the warm breath of agua fria, the sacred spring, ascending to the heavens like a silent, enduring prayer. It was a reminder of a promise made, a promise kept, a promise that would now be the foundation of their lives, as constant and as life-giving as the water that flowed at their feet. Thank you for listening to our story. We invite you to comment with where you are listening from so we can all connect and share our thoughts. And please remember to subscribe to our channel Wild West Tales, like the video, and support us further by pressing the hype button so this story can be heard by more people.